Is this a budding bromance that will help pull the Philippines' gaze away from China?
I sang uninvited upon the orders of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States.
And back to its long-standing ally. US-Filipino relations soured when former President Barack Obama criticised Duterte's violent war on drugs, which has killed thousands of people. Duterte responded by calling Obama, and he's increasingly cozied up to China since. But relations have warmed under Trump, who has in the past praised Duterte for doing what he called an unbelievable job with the Philippines' drug problem. And as Trump and Duterte met on the sidelines of the annual Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit in Manila, there was no mention of Duterte's questionable human rights record.
We've had a great relationship. This has been very successful.
But some argue that Duterte isn't good company for the US to be keeping, and that it shouldn't be embracing a strongman just to keep his affections away from China. The ASEAN summit was the final leg of Trump's marathon tour of Asia. After campaigning on an America First platform, there was speculation he would reverse the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, leaving the region open for China to dominate. But his rhetoric throughout this tour focused on the Indo-Pacific, seemingly not a slip of the tongue, but a calculated effort to counter China's influence.
So we want our partners in the region to be strong, independent, and prosperous, in control of their own destinies, and satellites to no one. These are the principles behind our vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific.
The dispute over the South China Sea is one of the region's biggest sources of tension, and one of the main areas where the tide of the Philippines' foreign policy has turned towards China, with Duterte agreeing to halt work on the islands there and pushing for de-escalation. Now Trump has raised his hand to act as mediator.
We've had a dispute for quite a while with China. If I can help in any way, I'm a very good mediator and a very good arbitrator.
Has Trump's tour of Asia sent the message that the US wants in or out of influencing the region? And has he done enough to win over Duterte? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Manila is law professor Joy Batong Pakal. He used to advise the Philippine government on maritime issues. And in Hong Kong, we have Joseph Cheng. He's a political scientist and democracy activist. And Jeff Smith joins us from Washington, D.C. He's a South Asia Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation and author of Asia's Quest for Balance, China's Rise and Rebalancing in the Indo-Pacific. Gentlemen, I thank you all for joining us. Joy Batong Pakal, can I begin with you first? And of course, we're going to be talking about the U.S. and Philippines bilaterally only initially, and then we'll broaden it out into other things such as the South China Sea. Compared to when Obama was president and you had Rodrigo Duterte saying things like son of a, whatever you want to call it, and the tensions, this is a good time for the US and the Philippines, isn't it?
Well, yes, certainly it's a marked change in attitude on the part of President Duterte. And I think it's more directed towards the leader rather than the country itself.
I see, very interesting. Jeff Smith, is it all about the leader? Has Trump put on the charm offensive when it comes to Duterte? Do the two men seem to be compatible?
Well, the optics of the relationship certainly seem to be a lot better. And if it's not just about the leader, then that's not such a bad thing for the U.S. and the Philippines either. You know, the Philippines regularly polls as one of the most pro-American publics in the region and frankly, probably in the world. And the U.S. is very highly regarded among the security establishment and large sectors of society. So the rift in U.S.-Filipino relations that began under President Obama and President Duterte was leader-driven. The optics at the leader level seem to be much better now, but I think there are also still very strong people-to-people bonds and military-to-military bonds in the relationship.
Joseph Cheng, geopolitically, is the United States trying to drag the Philippines back into the U.S. orbit and away from China?
Certainly. So the United States, under the Donald Trump administration now wants to demonstrate that it is interested in the region. It intends to strengthen relations with its former allies and partners and so on. There is obvious an intention to demonstrate that the United States would like to play a very, very important role in the region in competition with China. On the part of Beijing, obviously, it understands this intention of the Donald Trump administration, and it is very happy, at least, that the Duterte administration doesn't want to pursue the Permanent Court of Arbitration verdict on the territorial dispute.
Right, and we're going to broaden it out into the South China Sea in just a few minutes' time, so bear with me. But let me ask you, Jay, as we try to understand Duterte, because Duterte is a bit of an enigma when it comes to the rest of the world. Can we say that he is anti-Western but makes exceptions for the likes of Donald Trump because Trump is a maverick?
Well, I think it's more personality-driven for President Duterte because, after all, he himself is a populist president. So he tends towards populist leaders like Trump. And I think really it's also part of the politics that he has been involved in local politics here in the Philippines. It is very much personality driven. So we're seeing this being reflected basically on the international stage.
Jeff Smith, a lot of civilians, a lot of innocent people have been caught up in the Philippines drug war. Human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others have documented what they call extrajudicial killings. A lot of people would have wanted Donald Trump to bring this up. He did not, and they both Duterte and Trump seem to have a plan for this anyway, even if it was brought up. Have they both decided that it's not worth the trouble for them both to talk about this at all? Well,
if you look at President Trump's trip more broadly, I think with the exception of North Korea, which he did ding on human rights in a very prominent manner during his speech, human rights has not been a central focus of his discussions, whether it's with President Duterte or President Xi. His public remarks in general, in both bilaterals and in his broader speeches, have not placed a great emphasis on human rights. But Secretary Tillerson and others in the administration have emphasized that in private and behind the scenes, the human rights issue has been a point of emphasis.
Yeah, Jeff, would you say that the fundamental core of what Trump was trying to achieve in this trip was to build as broad an alliance as possible with regards to North Korea and hoping to get the Philippines on board with that as well?
I think there were, frankly, a lot of objectives, and I think we have to broaden it out beyond the Philippines if you want to talk about the fundamental objectives of the whole Asia trip. I think North Korea was certainly a significant focal point, but there was also, I think, a particularly meaningful meeting of the quadrilateral dialogue, an assembly of the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, exactly 10 years after our first attempt at forming a quadrilateral among the four Indo-Pacific democracies fell apart. So there was a meeting on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit among those four. So there were, I think, several themes and objectives with the trip, and building a coalition against North Korea was certainly one of them. And building a coalition around the idea of promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific was a second important objective, and I think there were some meaningful steps taken in that regard.
Joseph Cheng, let's talk about the South China Sea. Trump saying, with regards to the South China Sea, if I can help in any way, I'm a very good mediator and a very good arbitrator. Do you think that's true?
Well, traditionally, China believes that it should only deal with the countries directly involved in territorial disputes on a bilateral basis. And with regard to the regional security, it accepts that it has to deal with these issues on a multilateral approach. But it certainly considers that the United States is a power external to the region, and I think it has already just expressed reservations about the mediator role on the part of the United States. I think this proposal actually comes quite as a surprise to the parties concerned, and China didn't exactly expected this proposal.
Yeah, Joseph, given that many of the other countries consider that China has been cheating by establishing facts on the ground, by having its own 9-dash line, by those military bases that it builds on the islands, is their position that China is cheating going to be strengthened if the United States tries to mediate between them and the Chinese? Does that make it more difficult for China?
Chinese leaders and the Chinese people probably think that territorial issues are non-negotiable. However, Chinese leaders understand the importance of avoiding a military conflict or avoiding any serious escalation of tension, and that explains why it is quite eager, in fact, to establish confidence-building measures type of agreement with the American government. It doesn't quite believe that a code of conduct agreement is to its advantage, and so it accepts this as a matter of principle, but has been adopting delaying tactics in arriving in concluding such an agreement.
Jay, has the Philippines' claim on the South China Sea been strengthened or weakened after Trump's visit?
Well, I think the situation in the South China Sea is still the same, because despite the atmosphere of friendliness and cordiality between the Philippines and China, obviously the facts on the ground are different and the challenges still remain. Just a few months ago, there was a big issue over a cay near Pagasa Island, for example, and that presented a particular problem. And that really is just a manifestation of the ongoing tiff really on the ground. No? Even if diplomatically and officially everything seems fine, when you look at what's happening at sea, we still are encountering problems with China, with its forces moving around in the South China Sea.
Yeah, Jeff, we're hearing that China is guaranteeing safe passage for all nations using the South China Sea, also willing to work with ASEAN to maintain peace in the strategic waterway. That's what they say. Is that encouraging, or do you not believe them?
Well, our concern has always been with freedom of navigation in general, but specifically with regard to freedom of navigation for U.S. military vessels and military vessels of other countries. While China is correct in that it has not challenged freedom of navigation for commercial vessels, it has done so for U.S. warships and airplanes operating in the South China Sea legally under the rules and designations of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which America has not ratified, but the United States has always upheld the maritime jurisdiction delineations, which suggest that the U.S. is free to operate in international waters and in the exclusive economic zone of countries in certain conditions. And our main concern has been Chinese attempts to prevent the U.S. and other warships and aircraft from operating legally in these international waters. And there have been several prominent incidents of unsafe intercepts, confrontations at sea. Just last December, China very brazenly seized a U.S. Navy underwater drone, which was operating in international waters even beyond China's 9-dash line. So that was concerning, as have a few unsafe intercepts that have been conducted this year. But our focus really has been on freedom of navigation for military vessels, which is why you've seen the Trump administration take a more concerted approach to freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. Joseph, those are fairly well documented and I guess warranted concerns from the U.S., aren't they?
Yes. Well, China understands that it is in no position to challenge the American naval superiority at this stage. It believes that time is on its side with regard to the balance of power between the two major powers. It accepts freedom of navigation, and it is in no position, in fact, to protect the vital sea lanes from the coastal provinces in the east to the Middle East. However, it is certainly building up its power projection capabilities. It is creating artificial land on the islands that it has been occupying. And it certainly would not like the United States to challenge what it claims as territorial waters and exclusive economic zones based on the islands that it occupies in the Spratleys and the surrounding areas, including the Paracels as well.
Jeff, would it be better then for the United States to deal directly with China here rather than trying to position itself as a mediator between China and everybody else who has a claim with regards to South China Sea? Why doesn't it just come out frankly and say, hey, listen, it's about our military vessels. We want safe passage. We don't want you interfering with us. It's between you and us. Why does the United States have to come in as peacemaker?
Well, I don't know that we are coming in as peacemaker. I mean, President Trump's comments were simply that I'd be happy to offer my services as a mediator if you want it. And if you don't, that's fine too, was the implication. The freedom of navigation issue is a bilateral issue between China and the U.S. And in fact, this is our one articulated national interest in the South China Sea, something that we will work to uphold vigorously. Whether or not the Philippines and China reach an agreement on the arbitration award is something that we have an interest in and we're concerned with, but is not in America's national interest, is not what China would call a core interest. Freedom of navigation is, and that's where we're going to maintain our focus.
Okay, let's go super broad again. And Jay, let me ask you about the pivot to Asia. Donald Trump doesn't like to be associated with things that were started by Barack Obama. He's always tried to distance himself from things that Barack Obama started. But undoubtedly, with him being in Asia, it seems as if it's a continuation of something that was started by his predecessor. The pivot to Asia, it has begun, maybe it has happened. What has the Philippines gotten out of it? What's of value to the Philippines, given that the United States is taking Asia and East Asia particularly more seriously?
Well, I think for now it's really just a kind of reassurance, no? Because after all, American interests in the Asia-Pacific and within this region have historically been, consistent. It has a long history, even earlier than Obama, and now that interest will continue even after Trump. So it's just that the optics and the presentation of the leaders and the particular implementation, that's the one that changes, over administrations. For now, because of the pre-established rapport between President Duterte and President Trump, it seems like that has provided some measure, again, of reassurance that at least that consistent policy will remain. No? But on the other hand, you also have to contend with President Duterte's attempt really to come closer to China, his own so-called pivot to China. And what we're going to see, I guess, in the future is how he tries to balance these two forces that he's trying to establish some kind of equidistance between.
Joseph Cheng, is Washington's pivot to Asia invariably going to crash into the Chinese dragon?
Well, there is a lot of competition, but at the moment, China's basic approach is to contain the differences and to develop the common interest, because China understands that it is in no position to challenge the United States at this stage. It needs time. And it probably understands that in the eyes of most countries in Asia, the Donald Trump administration remains unreliable, or at least rather unpredictable. We see in this trip, Donald Trump has been trying to repair relationship with, say, Japan, South Korea, and so on, because Japan certainly was disappointed with the abandonment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and both Tokyo and Seoul were not very happy during the election campaign when Donald Trump criticized their lack of adequate commitments or financial burdens, responsibilities in paying for the American troops stationed in these two countries.
Jeff Smith, very finally, the Middle East is a mess. The United States has been trying to extricate itself from many of the issues there. Should it be focusing more of its foreign policy objectives beyond trade? I mean, when it comes to actual foreign policy and the politics, the dirty game of politics, should be focusing more on East Asia?
Absolutely. I think East Asia is becoming the nexus of trade and geopolitics and security issues, but not just East Asia. Really, you know, a term that you've heard a lot more in the recent weeks is the Indo-Pacific. Mm-hmm. And I think the U.S. government and strategic analysts are increasingly looking at East Asia and the Indian Ocean region as one kind of interconnected geopolitical, geoeconomic space that is in many ways at the crux of global politics and global economics. And I think this shift in focus toward the Indo-Pacific that you saw begin under the Obama administration will continue under President Trump and under his successors, because the strategic logic on the ground dictates as such, and American national interests dictate as such. That doesn't mean we're going to be abandoning the Middle East or Europe, but it means that this part of the world is going to be occupying an ever greater share of our attention.
Well, Trump has promised a major statement on trade, probably on Wednesday when he's back home, especially after that APEC summit. We'll be watching and listening closely to what he has to say. Maybe he'll announce it on Twitter. Gentlemen, it's been good to hear your thoughts. Jay Patong Pakal, Joseph Cheng, and Jeff Smith. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.